A classic haunted mansion harboring the ghosts of some of our country's most famous names, a sprawling cemetery where the dead wander amongst their graves, and an eerie wax museum whose figures come to life after dark await on this journey through some more of New York's most haunted places. Let's jump right in. Hey guys, and thanks for joining me for another journey through some more of New York's most haunted places. Recognized for hosting the largest city in the US, for its unique culture, beautiful upstate nature expanses, historic landmarks, good food, and more, the Empire State also harbors some of America's oldest and most chilling ghost stories. Are you sure you're ready to hear them? Our first haunt takes us to northeastern upstate New York and has us booking seats at the prestigious Landmark Theater. The Landmark Theater, which is placed in the heart of Syracuse, New York, is a historic entertainment venue that's nearly 100 years old, that still acts as a popular arts and live performance center to the city, and its bounds are rumored to be haunted by a range of restless spirits tied to its past. Historically, in 1926, and amidst a growing populace, the Loews Corporation would recognize the need for a larger entertainment venue in town, and would select a plot at the intersection of South Salina and West Jefferson Streets for the construction of their new project. Notably, this same plot formerly held the renowned Jefferson Hotel, and strategically speaking, Loews knew that the community already had their eye on the property. What was first recognized as the Loews State Theater would first open its doors on February 18th of 1928, and would offer double bills of famous vaudeville stage acts and first-run films. Unfortunately, just a year later, the Great Depression would sweep the nation, and though many businesses would fail at this time, the theater did surprisingly well as the down populace paid to watch its shows and escape reality for a few hours. Subsequently, through World War II, business would boom again as soldiers, love interests, and their families attended shows either before, between, or after deployments. While the theater prospered for a time, sadly, through the 1970s, it would begin suffering from low attendance and would slowly fall into disrepair, resulting in its closure in 1975. Despite its significance, some interested parties would consider the old haunt an eyesore, and for a time, it was actually in danger of being demolished. In 1976, however, the Syracuse Area Landmark Theater, or SALT Group, was formed to preserve and renovate the space, and following a 1977 Harry Chopin benefit concert and the raising of $65,000, the group would purchase the property and would rename the venue as the Landmark Theater. Notably, their purchase of the old structure would include the property and ground floor, while the upper floors still remained under the ownership of Sutton Real Estate. As they successfully ran theater operations, eventually SALT would earn enough to purchase the first 2 floors of the building, and from October of 2010 to November of 2011, they would perform a $16 million renovation that would result in the expansion of the venue's backstage, while also adding new dressing rooms and green rooms. Ultimately, their goal was to be accommodating for larger, longer-running events. Additionally, this renovation would see the old loading dock removed and replaced with a new 2-bay dock, while the box office was moved from Jefferson to Salina Street to where the original lobby entrance and wooden ticket booth, which weren't used since Loews owned the site, were placed. The Landmark Theater remains in operation today, and even in the present, SALT is ever striving to provide a top theater experience, while constantly improving and upgrading the site. Over its many years, the Landmark has not only grown in fame for its prestige and historical significance, but also in infamy due to a purported assortment of chilling hauntings, and both staff and guests have reported extreme cold spots in temperature-controlled rooms, instances of doors opening and closing on their own, and accounts of theater chairs folding down and back up as if someone unseen is sitting in them. One more prolific spirit at the Landmark is believed to be that of Thomas Lamb, who worked as a lead architect in its original design. As it's told, a carving above exit door 15 depicts him, and an apparition bearing his likeness has been sighted in passing, and is always gone when witnesses turn to get a better look. Informal investigations of the theater have yielded high EMF levels, chilling EVPs, and hits on spirit boxes, while others have told of catching orbs or strange silhouettes in photography and video. Easily the most famous ghost story surrounding the Landmark ties itself to a former patron named Clarissa. Now, as it's told, sometime through the 1930s, Clarissa was attending a performance and had obtained balcony seating. Unfortunately, while leaning over the railing, Clarissa slipped and fell to her death. To this day, many have told of watching the figure of a woman in a white dress tumble over the balcony only to vanish before impact, and some have even cited her walking around on ground level, only to pass straight through solid walls. Our second haunt takes us on a short journey down the Hudson and north of New York City to the historic Kingston Stockade District. The Kingston Stockade District, which is located where else but in Kingston, New York, is an 8-block section placed on the western end of the city that is actually the original site of the mid-17th century Dutch settlement that spurred the growth of the metro. Its bounds contain a slew of kitschy restaurants, shops, bars, and event venues, and alongside being a popular stop for both locals and tourists, it also harbors a much darker reputation for its purported haunted hotspots and spine-tingling ghost stories. Historically, Kingston's roots begin through the mid-1600s, through the creation of the Dutch village of Wiltwyck, which was formally founded in 1652, and the whole of this community was plotted on a raised plain adjacent to the drainage of Rondout Creek, due to it being easily defensible. Incidentally, and likely due to its efficiency, this community would quickly grow as more colonists arrived. Later, in 1658, Dutch colonial governor Peter Stuyvesant would supervise the creation of a village just behind the stockade, and would subsequently order all settlers near to move to this site for safety from native raids. Unfortunately, in 1663, this village would burn to the ground in a fire, after which it was rebuilt and would stand through the early 18th century, when it had grown to include a palisade wall that formed a bastion and streets along its boundaries, both of which that remain to this day. In 1777, the township was chosen to host the Constitutional Convention that actually established New York as a state, with George Clinton chosen as its first governor, and John Jay as the first Chief Justice of the United States. And together, they would open the first term of the New York Supreme Court in what was to be called Kingston. Sadly, later the same year, the British would take advantage of the undefended city, and would burn it to the ground, with a total of over 300 buildings destroyed. Slowly, however, the city was rebuilt true to its original plan, and 5 years later, George Washington himself would actually visit Kingston and would compliment Stuyvesant on the creation of the stockade. On a side note, in 1783, as the war was ending, the state of New York would actually suggest Kingston to be utilized as a national capital. Through the turn of the 19th century, Kingston would continue to grow with new buildings sprouting up across the landscape, and in 1818, the county courthouse, which still stands today, was constructed. In 1852, the Old Dutch Church, whose congregation had met in various buildings over the years prior, was constructed, and its 200-foot-tall white tower would quickly come to be recognized as a local landmark of sorts. As the city continued to grow, it was met by the adjacent community of Rondout, resulting in the two metros merging into one. Notably, Rondout grew successfully for its placement on the northern end of the Delaware and Hudson Canal, and while the joined communities would be recognized as Kingston, what was formerly Kingston proper would come to be known as Uptown, while the former commercial center of Rondout lands would be called Downtown. Through the early 20th century, community members would begin taking an interest in the preservation of the old stockade, as some of its oldest buildings, dating back to the 1600s, were at risk of demolition. Incidentally, the Daughters of the American Revolution chapter would perform extensive work on the neighborhood, including in the restoration of the historic 1695 Henry Slight House, which actually acts as their headquarters to this day. Later, in 1908, the body of George Clinton, who was buried in Washington, was moved back to Kingston and was laid to rest in the Old Dutch churchyard. Possibly most significantly, in 1965, the group called Friends of the Senate House was founded to protect this historic structure. However, following restorations, the Friends would expand their mission to not just focus on the Senate House, but also on the preservation of all of the area's significant historic structures, reestablishing themselves as the Friends of Historic Kingston. 4 years later, in 1969, the Friends would manage to have the original Clinton Avenue Historic District recognized as a historic district, marking it as the first listing on the National Register. Today, the Kingston Stockade District stands as one of the most popular places in the area, hosting a slew of events, historic tours, some of the best food and drink around, and much, much more. As part of the stockade's darker history, in 1691, the whole of the area played host to a brutal massacre, and as legend has it, the neighborhood is absolutely teeming with spirits, with those frequenting it reporting specters that roam the streets at night, figures sighted through the windows of buildings that should be locked up and empty, and extreme cold spots that are even felt on warm days. Easily one of the most famous haunted hotspots in the district is that of the aforementioned iconic Old Dutch Church, along with its associated churchyard. One of the oldest legends surrounding this chapel tells that long ago, a clergyman and his wife were sailing the Hudson on a particularly stormy night when a hobgoblin, which was pretty much a taller version of the classic image of a goblin, complete with wings, swooped down and perched on their ship. The clergyman prayed the goblin away, but later, when he reached Kingston, he found the creature perched on the bell tower of the church. To this day, it's said the hobgoblin still lingers in the area and can usually be seen during storms or heavy fogs. Additionally, the churchyard acts as a final resting place to a number of soldiers, sailors, and to the community's early inhabitants. And those who have passed by it, especially after dark, have told of figures in old-fashioned clothing moving amongst the graves, and of a spectral man in a top hat that's been sighted both in the yard and within the church office. Within the Kingston City Hall, which was built in 1875, both visitors and staff have reported disembodied footsteps, flickering lights, and doors that open and close on their own. The old Senate House is prone to extreme cold spots felt in hot weather and orbs captured in photography, and several have told of eerie moaning and strange silhouettes sighted within the low Bogardus ruin after dark. Now, while we could keep going, in all honesty, pretty much the whole of the Stockade area and all of its old buildings are absolutely jam-packed with ghost stories and tales of pretty much any sort of paranormal activity you could possibly imagine, marking it not just as one of the most fascinating historic sites in New York, but also easily as one of its most haunted. Our third haunt has us exploring New York City's Washington Heights neighborhood and touring the iconic Morris Jumel Mansion. The Morris Jumel Mansion, which is located in the Washington Heights neighborhood of New York City, is an iconic 18th century historic landmark museum site recognized as the oldest extant house in all of Manhattan. Its bounds are a popular stop for both tourists and locals, and it's grown in infamy for its ties to some pretty chilling paranormal activity. Historically, predating European settlement, lands now holding the mansion, and most of New York for that matter, were inhabited by tribes native to the region, including the Lenape, who utilized the lush surroundings provided by the Hudson for hunting, fishing, and the forming of communities. Circa the turn of the 17th century, a wealth of Dutch families would begin migrating to the area. In 1614, Fort Nassau would be established right around where Albany sits today, and in 1624, the settlement of New Amsterdam was formed, on the southern tip of Manhattan Island. Later, in 1658, the town of Harlem was established to include the property now holding the mansion, with the abode's grounds falling in an area then known as the Great Maze Land. From 1695 to 1696, one Jan Kiersen would receive a half morgen of land, or just under 1,500 square yards, and would build the site's first house, and would also get permission to build a house, a barn, and a garden east of the area that now holds St. Nicholas Avenue. From 1700 to 1701, Kiersen would be granted a deed to the land, and would slowly begin enlarging his estate. Through the 1750s, the Kiersen estate was passed down to Jan's daughter, Janti, and her husband, Jacob Dickman, while his other two sons would sell off their interests in the site. And in 1763, the property was sold to one James Carroll for the price of 1,000 New York pounds. Subsequently, Carroll would only farm the land for 2 years before, in 1765, selling it off to British Colonel Roger Morris and his wife Mary, who had their own plans for development of a brand new estate. Construction of Roger's dream abode would start later the same year, and when his creation was finished, it would be recognized as Mount Morris. Over the years, Morris would greatly expand the property while constructing outbuildings, and would welcome 2 sons and 2 daughters into the world there. Unfortunately for Roger, however, in 1775, the Revolutionary War would begin, and Morris, as part of the New York Legislative Council, would flee back to England to protect his family. Through the war, the Continental Army would gain control of the property, and its bounds would be utilized as a headquarters by who else but our founding father, George Washington, while nearly 8,000 troops would set up camps across its grounds. Following a continental retreat through October of 1776, the British would also occupy the house, and they would remain there until the evacuation of New York in 1783, after which the Act of Attainder would dictate it, along with all other Loyalist properties, be totally confiscated. Over the following decades, the estate would be utilized as a rented farm, as a tavern for a time, and for a variety of other purposes, until 1810, when French wine merchant Stephen Jamal and his wife Eliza, who were accompanied by their adopted daughter Mary Bowen, would pay $10,000 for both the house and a small bit of land surrounding it. Through their ownership, the Jumels would modernize, expand, and upgrade the old abode, with Stephen publicly stating the remodels were a gift for Eliza, and the family would split time between there and another Upper Manhattan mansion, amongst frequent visits to France. Following Stephen's death in a carriage accident in 1832, ownership of the mansion would be transferred to Mary Bowen, who would go on to marry a lawyer named Nelson Chase, and who would live on site with both her husband and mother. Surprisingly, Mary would pass on in 1848 and Eliza would actually outlive her and would remain on site until her passing nearly 20 years later in 1865. While the estate would stay in Chase family hands for a time, eventually it would be sold off and would change hands a number more times. And following the turn of the 20th century, it would be acquired by the state, who, in 1907, opened it up as a museum. Through the 20th century and into the present, the museum site has welcomed a number of famous guests, including Queen Elizabeth II, and a range of renovations. In 1961, the site would be established as a National Historic Landmark, and in 1966, it would be added to the National Register of Historic Places. The Morris Jumel Mansion remains open into the present, offering tours, events, and more. Standing as the classic haunted mansion, the Morris Jumel residence has long been shrouded in tales of the inexplicable, earning it a place amongst America's most haunted houses. And both staff and visitors to the site have reported extreme cold spots and strange drafts felt in temperature-controlled rooms, instances of doors and windows opening or closing by themselves, and full conversations heard from around corners that, when those listening go to investigate, they find whatever spaces they seem to be emanating from completely empty. One more popular mansion ghost story tells the property is haunted by the spirit of Stephen Jumel himself. According to paranormal investigators who supposedly picked up old Steve's voice in recordings, the carriage accident that took his life wasn't actually an accident at all, but a plot organized by his wife, Eliza. A spectral form matching Stephen has been sighted roaming the halls and darkest corners of the mansion, seemingly watching the living from a distance, and some say his soul is vengeful from never having his true fate discovered. Another of the mansion's more prominent apparitions is said to be none other than that of U.S. Vice President Aaron Burr, who worked through Jefferson's first term. In 1833, Burr actually married Eliza following Stephen's passing, and it's said he spent many happy nights on site. Incidentally, some theorize his spirit returned to the place he held dear in life, and within his old bedroom, paranormal investigations have yielded EVPs of his voice, as well as a silhouette captured in photography that matches his description. Throughout the whole of the residence, and not believed to be linked to any one spirit in particular, guests have reported disembodied footsteps from empty halls, phantom whispers, and instances of objects moving on their own. Lights flicker without cause, and several have reported extreme and inexplicable chills that only dissipate once they've left the property. Activity on site is so infamous, in fact, that the mansion has been covered in several high-profile series, such as BuzzFeed Unsolved and The Holzer Files. Finally, possibly the most famous apparition encountered on site is that of our country's father, none other than George Washington himself, who has been known to round corners in his blue wool coat and with his powdered gray ponytail, astonishing bystanders with his 6'2" stature before fading into nothingness. Our fourth haunt has us straddling the New York-Ontario border and taking a walk through the prestigious Forest Lawn Cemetery. Forest Lawn Cemetery, which is located in Buffalo, New York, is a massively sprawling 269-acre garden burying ground that holds the title of being the largest and most popular graveyard in the whole of the city. That's bounds are visited by countless tourists each day, and that's rumored to harbor a number of high-profile hauntings and spine-tingling supernatural phenomena. Historically, prior to its creation in the mid-19th century, the city of Buffalo would rely on several smaller graveyards to bury their dead. Lands now holding Forest Lawn originally belonged to one Erastus Granger, who actually built a farm on the northern end of the plot, and who would work utilizing the tillable sections of the hill-covered terrain. Under President Thomas Jefferson, Granger would be appointed the superintendent of the Six Nations Agency, and would maintain a relationship with the Seneca Nation, who occupied the region. Following Granger's death, however, in 1850, his lands would be purchased by local Buffalo attorney William D. Clark, who had a dream. Predating Clark's purchase, a rural cemetery movement had begun to sweep the nation following the establishment of the Mount Auburn Cemetery near Boston in 1831, followed closely by Laurel Hill in Philadelphia, Greenwood in Brooklyn, and Spring Grove in Cincinnati. And Clark, who was an idealist and philanthropist, desired for Buffalo to have its own beautiful garden cemetery. Clark would meticulously design a plan for a cemetery unlike any other in the area, one with sprawling pastures, unique trees, water features, winding trails, and prominently unique sections and markers. On a side note, while she was not mentioned on the indenture, historians have since discovered that William's wife, being Mary Anna Clark, was also very active in the planning and operation of this venture. By the late 1800s, and in the shadow of ailments like tuberculosis, scarlet fever, and pandemic influenza, a public fear of disease would form and would lead to a change in what people thought was needed for burial grounds. Small local churchyards, all crammed into tight spaces, were viewed as unsanitary and as a threat to the public. And incidentally, many began seeking out areas instead that were further from town, with more land and a more peaceful setting. This eventually led to a rise in rural cemeteries and in Clark's Yard quickly growing in popularity. While Buffalo eventually expanded to encompass Forest Lawn, efforts to preserve its natural setting were quite successful. In 1901, and in recognition of the 1901 Pan American Exposition, one Henry Osgood Holland would be contracted to design and create the cemetery's now famous Beaux Arts-style entrance off the corner of Main Street and West Delavan Avenue, and it would feature lodges on each side that would accommodate spaces for gatekeepers and for rest areas for the public. Starting in 1951, Forest Lawn would begin an era of growth, with planning for several new sections in the northeastern corner put in place. And between 1972 and 1990, the Oakwood, Birchwood, and Rosewood atrium mausoleums were constructed, offering a new option for both entombments and interments. Notably, in 1979, construction of 500 crypts in Section 28 was started, and later, in 1998, Forest Lawn would acquire ownership and merge with Lakeside Cemetery in Hamburg. More recently, in 2001, Forest Lawn would also merge with the Williamsville Cemetery. In 2002, walking tours of the yard were introduced, and in 2004, the Serenity Mausoleum was opened. In 2006, the 10th anniversary of Sunday in the Cemetery tours and lectures was celebrated. In 2008, St. Matthew's Cemetery in West Seneca was acquired under the Forest Lawn Cemetery Group, and in 2010, the yard would acquire Civil War military monuments for the previously unrecognized graves of Union soldiers. In the present, Forest Lawn remains open to the public and is popular not just amongst visiting family members and those seeking to learn its history, but has also become a hotspot for paranormal investigators and those interested in the supernatural. And rightfully so, as the whole of these burying grounds have long been surrounded in stories of supernatural phenomena, with those braving their bounds reporting shadowy figures that dart amongst the headstones, instances of phones or other personal electronics behaving erratically or dying on full charges, and tales of cars parked near refusing to start, leaving their motorists stranded in the parking lot and usually under a fading sun. One of the cemetery's most famous ghost stories revolves around some of its most famous interments, being former U.S. President Millard Fillmore and his wife, First Lady Abigail Fillmore. As history has it, Abigail would pass on in 1853, while Millard would pass on later in 1874. And as legend has it, their souls, bound by love, sought each other out in the afterlife. To this day, many who have passed their graves, especially after dark, have seen both of their apparitions seemingly searching the landscape, and at times, together, embracing lovingly while whispering sweet nothings into each other's ears. Informal investigations of the yard have yielded high EMF levels, chilling EVPs, and hits on thermal grids, Ouija boards, and spirit boxes, while others have told of taking pictures or video footage that appears normal at first, only for them to find strange silhouettes or orbs of light in the background later that weren't visibly present at the time the shots were taken. Some more disturbing stories detail the countless buried on site who perished to various diseases over the eras. As it's told, a great deal of those who were claimed by said ailments were taken well before their time, and their bodies refused to rest. Incidentally, those who have encountered these spirits, or whatever they are, describe rotted, pale, and ghoulish corpses that lumber about the yard, seemingly searching for some semblance of the lives they desire. Rather eerily, several have told of these grotesque things behaving erratically or even aggressively. Also reported across graveyard grounds are accounts of strange fogs that descend upon the plot alone on otherwise clear nights. During these fogs, those who have passed by or entered Forest Lawn have reported a host of odd occurrences, such as tombstones that glow, strong winds, and the smells of tobacco smoke, food, or old cologne or perfume without source. Strangely, when these fogs are present, electronic devices seem to malfunction, and several have described feeling disoriented, resulting in them passing by the same markers again and again, as if they're stuck in a loop. Another famous Forest Lawn tale ties itself to the local burial of esteemed singer-songwriter James Ambrose Johnson Jr., or more affectionately, Rick James. Mr. James lived a charmed life and produced some of our country's most timeless classics, before passing away in 2004 at the age of 56, after which he was laid to rest in Forest Lawn. Some claim his soul and music live on here, however, and some downright bizarre stories detail instances in which a ghostly James has been sighted singing and performing after dark to an audience of skeletons that dance to his beat. Last but not least, our fifth and final hunt takes us to the center of the state of New York and places us in the town of Lake George. Lake George, which is placed in Warren County, New York, is a small lakeside town boasting a population of around 3,500 that's exceedingly popular for its quaint shops, good restaurants, bars, events, and other attractions, especially amongst those seeking a summer retreat from larger nearby metros, and that also harbors a long and tumultuous history and diverse assortment of associated urban legends, ghost stories, and chilling old hill folklore. Historically, the actual lake itself around which the town was established was formed 10 to 12,000 years ago, and while we have a rough history of its discovery amongst European parties, it's speculated that it was utilized by native tribes possibly for millennia, all of whom flourished in the lush wilderness through its provision of fresh water and ample hunting and fishing opportunities. While there is debate over who the first non-native party to find the lake actually was, today, it's generally accepted that this honor goes to either Samuel de Champlain in the early 1600s or Father Isaac Hogues through the 1640s. And whatever the case, the good father, who was a French Jesuit missionary, would actually be captured by Mohawks during his travels, would escape, return to France, and would later be sent back to establish a peace treaty with the Iroquois, after which he would officiate the expanse's name as Lac du Saint-Sacrement, or the Lake of the Blessed Sacrament, in 1646. Over a century later, the French and Indian War, or 7 Years' War, would break out in the shadow of France's expansion to British colonial territory, and the lake and its region would act as a crucial conquest to the British as the French already claimed Canada and other areas to the north. During this time, British General Edward Braddock would order one Commander William Johnson to defeat the French at Fort St. Frederick, and as Johnson traveled north, he would rename the expanse Lake George in honor of the king. Subsequently, the same year, a series of 3 battles between the British and French would break out towards the southern end of the lake, and this conflict would come to be known as the Battle of Lake George, which is now considered one of the first major victories for England against France in America. The same year, the now iconic Fort William Henry was constructed on the southern tip of the lake in order to safeguard British interests and to serve as a headquarters for their operations. Unfortunately, however, just 2 years later, it would be burned by the French. Another notable event around this same time was the Battle of Bloody Pond, during which a party of French soldiers was surrounded by provincials, who opened fire to a massacre, after which all resulting bodies were thrown into a nearby pond, turning the waters red. Through the late 1800s, a community around Lake George was beginning to grow, and over the next 100 years, the region's economy would be based primarily off of lumber and tourism, with a slew of hotels, cabins, and campsites further bolstering growing visitor numbers. In 1845, the lake would welcome the construction of the Warren County Courthouse, and through the turn of and well into the 20th century, a host of stores, restaurants, doctors' and dentists' offices, bars, entertainment venues, and more were established. Finally, in 1966, the construction of Highway 87 through the lake area would only serve to further bolster growing tourist numbers. Today, while the lake boasts a rather humble population, it plays host to up to hundreds of thousands of summer tourists some years. It offers a range of events and activities while catering to hikers, campers, horseback riders, boaters, anglers, hunters, and more. Now, this really comes as no surprise to anyone familiar with the region, but the whole of Lake George is absolutely saturated in haunted hotspots and tales of the otherworldly, and both locals and tourists alike have reported strange fogs and odd weather that affect the area alone, phantom gunfire and the clash of various battles heard emanating from thin air, and accounts of figures dressed in old uniforms or clothing that are at first thought to be actors, and that are there one moment and gone the next. One of the most famous local legends tells of the Lake George Monster, or Georgie for short. Comically, Georgie was invented in 1904 by painter Harry Watrous, and in result of a fishing bet he made with newspaper editor Colonel William Dalton Mann. While initially believed to be nothing more than the hoax it was designed as, in more recent times, a handful of reports from those boating or even hiking the lake shores have detailed sightings of something huge below its surface that breaches briefly to reveal an elongated snout and bulging eyes. A more popular haunt around the lake is the recreation of Fort William Henry, which was actually constructed through the 1950s in the exact footprint of the original. Through its standing, the original fort played witness to brutal battles, horrific epidemics, and countless deaths due to the climate and the elements. Incidentally, those who have neared the fort's recreation have reported musket and cannon fire, the disembodied screams of battle, and sightings of both ghostly soldiers in uniform and of civilians in old-fashioned clothing who look malnourished or sickly. Another high-profile haunt around Lake George is that of the old Warren County Courthouse. Completed in 1845, this site hosted countless trials that decided the fates of those being judged, while many were held in the jail that lies within its basement. Quite simply, it's believed to be haunted by the restless spirits of those whose entire lives were essentially ended within, and both staff and visitors have reported extreme cold spots, phantom footsteps, and even shadowy apparitions that usually appear within the site's old cells. One more curious and rather creepy location near the lake is easily that of the House of Frankenstein Wax Museum, which is filled with odd sculptures and scenes not just from the Mary Shelley novel, but also from various other pieces of literature and pop culture. While it's unknown who or what haunts the museum, those who have entered its bounds and staff that have closed up or stayed after dark have reported odd motion detected in the peripheral and have turned to find figures moved into different positions. It's believed that whatever spirit infests this space is utilizing its various wax creations as conduits to move in our living world. Both students and staff at the Lake George High School have told of odd malfunctions with personal electronics, disembodied sounds that emanate from empty classrooms, and strange growls that drift through the air. At the public library, books have been known to slide slowly off of racks, and some claim to hear the phantom whooshing of garments between the shelves. And those who frequent the village mall have told of strangely dressed figures that brush past them only to vanish seconds later. Lastly, reported all throughout town are instances of well-maintained cars refusing to start, accounts of objects in shops that are closed or locked up moving around on their own, and documentation of personal possessions carried by pedestrians disappearing suddenly and reappearing later in stores, restaurants, or bars that said pedestrians hadn't even entered yet. And some tales tell of hulking furry beasts in robes that roam the encroaching forests, with others warning simply to stay out of the woods at night. Thanks for joining me on another journey through some of the most haunted places in New York. If you enjoyed hearing my histories and ghost stories, subscribe to my channel, throw this upload a like, and share me with anyone you feel could use a good scare. I'll catch you all next time, and stay spooky.